Thanks so much for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi here with 9 News legal expert Whitney Traylor. And President Joe Biden announced earlier this month that he's pardoning all people who had federal convictions for simple possession of marijuana. That, though, because it's an executive order, could face some legal challenges. For more on that, we're now joined again here by 9 News legal expert Whitney Traylor. Whitney, I think one of the big takeaways for me, at least initially, was I was not aware that a president could simply get rid of all those past convictions, at least at a federal level. Could you explain just kind of how that works and how this kind of came to be?
Right. So the president has been and actually campaigned on some of these issues that he was going to not necessarily decriminalize, but look at some of these marijuana convictions. And so what's happened is these are, because he has control over the federal government, he's issued an executive order that those who have been convicted of simple marijuana charges, and I believe it's between 1992 and 2021, will receive a pardon. Now, this is just, as you pointed out, for a simple marijuana charge. So if there's other violence or other charges, they won't be pardoned. So currently, there's no one in federal prison that would be released because of this. There's nobody just being detained because of a federal simple marijuana charge. So who this would impact is about 6,500 people who have past convictions. And the reason why that's relevant is because they can't get employment and housing, certain things because of those convictions. So these pardons will actually have a real impact on people's ability to get jobs and rent and buy homes and those kind of things.
Could you explain to me quickly what simple possession means at the federal level?
Right. So as opposed to an intent to distribute, or if there's other aggravating circumstances, or if there's violence involved, or if there's, sometimes with the drug charges, there's other assault and those kind of things. So if it's anything like that, then that pardon won't apply. So this is, and it's really the notion, I mean, there's some people who are in jail for smoking a half of a joint, and they've been in jail for years and years. And so essentially what President Biden is saying is, because this has been legalized in so many states, that this is resulting in an unfair situation where people are having these charges when it's been legalized. So the big impact is not so much who's currently incarcerated as much as clearing their record so that they can move forward without that red mark on their file.
Exactly, and potentially get employment, as you mentioned, and the other impacts that sort of thing would happen. The president also issued this as an executive order, as we just talked about at the beginning. Does that set the stage for potential legal challenges, and if so, what would those look like?
It could set the stage for a legal challenge, and some Republican governors are saying we're not going along with this. The
right, because it's federal, so state would not be impacted by this.
Well, and that's exactly right. And the majority of these drug charges are statewide, and so there's some states. There's 19 states that have legalized recreational marijuana, and some of those governors have started to already expunge those records. And so as part of this executive order, President Biden actually encouraged governors to do the same thing on the state level, which is where you're going to see the majority of the charges. And the Republican governors are saying, one, this is overreach, that the president doesn't have the authority, so I will expect legal challenges. But they're also saying, look, he's pandering to voters, right, because this will have an impact. The majority of Gen Zers and millennials, they believe in marijuana legalization. I've seen a Gallup poll last year that said 68% of America believes in legalization, and 50% of Republicans. Now, this was in the Gallup poll in 2021. So knowing that, some people are saying the president is doing this for political purposes right before the midterms.
The timing is a little interesting.
Right, to get some of those young voters.
He also set the stage for this to potentially remove marijuana as a Schedule I classification under federal law. Now, that's a designation that's given to the most dangerous substances. So, for example, cocaine, heroin, all fall under that Schedule I classification.
Right.
Can he remove that? And if so, how would that potentially impact things moving forward for marijuana specifically?
Well, it's interesting because he was the only presidential candidate in 2020 who was against declassification. And so now there's been so much...
In the Democratic primary, you mean?
Right, yes. And so now there's been so much of a push for this because, as you pointed out, it is on the Controlled Substances Act. Similar, it's rated higher than fentanyl and meth, for example. So some people are saying that this is an improper classification to have it as a Schedule 1, and so it should be declassified. And I think as part of the executive order, he commissioned a study for a committee to go forward and look at possibly declassifying marijuana.
Could he just do that? Could he just issue an executive order that makes it a Schedule 2 or something else?
No, I don't think. I think that would have to be an act by Congress.
Okay.
So, but he, that's why I think he wants to look at it.
It's always tricky because we're kind of navigating this fine line of political versus legal here a little bit. So obviously,
but it is a relevant line because a lot of the legal issues relate to the political procedure.
Right.
Right. And so, and in fact, the Office of the Pardon Attorney.
We were talking about this right before we came on.
Yeah, it will actually issue the certificates, and so what it will be for these 6,500 people is essentially a certificate indicating that it's been a pardon, so they can use that with employers or as they're renting apartments or things like that.
There's so much that I didn't know about all this before. A, it happened, and B, learning a lot from you right now. But what else can President Biden do, if anything, to further reduce penalties for those who have been convicted of marijuana charges, including perhaps simple possession?
Well, the biggest issue is going to be in the states, and so he's going to have to do whatever he can to leverage some pressure on the states to do so. Now, a number of governors have already indicated in Pennsylvania and other places that they wanted this, and they were sort of ahead of the president on this. So I think in towards that, how they can sort of motivate a state is award federal grant money to, for states to look at this, or try to withhold federal grant money, those kind of things to try and encourage the states. But I think that's what he's trying to do, is sort of bridge, motivate some of these governors. And the Republican governors, several of them have already said, no, we're not going to comply. We don't agree with this. Some of them have pointed out, for example, there's people who had more serious crimes that were pled down to a simple marijuana charge. And so now if they're pardoned, the argument is that, well, this is really potentially a violent act or a more serious crime, which now is completely expunged from somebody's record. So some of the, and this is the political argument here is, as we're moving forward, high crime versus, decriminalizing certain things, defunding the police. So you kind of have this polarization of people saying law and order, law enforcement, and these other folks saying this has historically been inadequate. You have people jailed for years and years and years, where now people, politicians included, are making money off of this very thing that they're criminalizing. So there is this nuanced equity and justice argument, if you will, and I think that's an underlying argument for sure as this debates politically.
Well, I think it's very clear over the years, and again, this may be straying a little bit away from some of the legal avenues that we've been discussing, but there's no doubt that over the years that these marijuana-related crimes have impacted poor people and minority communities disproportionately, right?
Completely disproportionately, and this is actually where President Biden gets a lot of criticism for his sponsorship of the 1994 crime bill that incentivized prison construction and mass incarceration. And it was that bill actually that caused a significant rise in incarceration amongst particularly the black community. And so some folks are saying this is too little too late. Some folks are saying this is his reckoning with that 1994, because I think he's come out and said, he regretted it, or things were different. He's had some justification, because that did lead to mass incarceration. And so, this is just another step in the direction of justice and equity based on historical, practices. It's you have these politicians being judgmental and saying, 3 strikes you're out and all these kind of things, and then you legalize marijuana, and it's I think $32 billion a year industry, and now some of those same politicians like John Bonner and folks like that are actually on these boards of some of these, cannabis companies making money. So some folks are saying, look, it's a complete hypocrisy when there's people still in jail for possessing marijuana.
Yeah, very fascinating issue indeed. And one thing I can't help but think about is when you mentioned Biden's 1994 crime bill and his endorsement of it, that was, of course, part of the war on drugs, so to speak, and that now seems to be maybe being reconsidered. I think maybe even an understatement there. And one other thing that I can't help but think about is that I think a lot of that largely started with the Colorado vote back in 2012 to legalize marijuana. That, I think, by most measures, I know that there may be some people out there who may disagree. I'm not inflecting my own opinion on it, but I think largely it's seen as a success. There is, as you mentioned, a degree of bipartisan support for the legalization of marijuana. And again, one of the things that I can't help but think about is that started with the 2012 vote here in Colorado to legalize marijuana, along with Washington State, and that was enacted in 2014, largely seen as a success.
Definitely, and you look at California, Washington, Colorado, some of the first states that legalized, and yeah, you're exactly right. And you have to, and I think this is what has gotten the politicians and even some of the more conservative folks on board, is the tax revenue. And that's a significant source, and so that's something that folks are interested in. But Joe Biden pushing for the crime bill in '94 really led to the numbers. In the jails, that's when more jails were built, and that really, I think, is a black mark on his legacy, if you will. So these are, he's definitely making efforts and really following through on campaign promises.
Yeah.
For thus far in his term.
I'm curious to see what he does if over the final 2 years of his, at least of his term here, as well as whether or not he's able to keep a Democratic majority here in the midterms coming up next month. But as you mentioned, this may be, there's obvious some politically, some undertones here and some incentives for President Biden to do this. But Whitney Traylor, 9 News legal expert, we really appreciate your insight. Very, very interesting discussion and very interesting topic as well. So thanks so much for your time here today.
For sure, and this will be an issue that will continue to come up, because as long as it's among the states, and actually there are 5 states coming up with in their November elections to actually legalize.
Oh, okay. So that is also obviously something to watch for. I did not know that. So we've got 19 right now, 5 more potentially with it on the ballot. And again, there's quite a bit of degree of, we've seen it in some reddish states.
Right.
I think about Montana that's legalized marijuana. And so something we may see continuing.
Right. And 19 states have legalized recreational. 38 have legalized medicinal. And so now we may have 5 more. They have it on their midterm ballots. So we'll revisit this issue, I'm sure.
I'm sure we will. But each time we do, we'll have you on 9 News legal expert Whitney Traylor. Thanks so much for joining us here on 9 News Plus.
Sure thing.